Ali Kila and Salma Ali from Granada and Washington, respectively. You're listening to the Concordia Forum Zoom distant socializing sessions. We've been running since 10 a.m. UK time this morning, and alhamdulillah, we've had a number of very, very successful and interesting sessions. We're now moving on to our next session, which I am going to introduce the host and moderator for this session, a dear friend of ours, all the way from Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, Professor Adnan Zulfiqar. Professor, over to you, who will introduce our guest and moderate the next session. Thank you.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Can everybody hear me okay? Sound
yes.
is good? Okay, so I am going to move. I want to just make sure our guest is here. Yes, I see him. Okay, wonderful. So we are delighted today to have this session. I'm delighted to be able to participate in this conversation with the person who has been really leading the charge in this historic case before the International Court of Justice. This is the Attorney General and Minister of Justice in Gambia, His Excellency Abubacarr Tambadou. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Tambadou.
Tambadou. Okay, wonderful. So it's wonderful to have you here with us, Minister, and I'm really interested in kind of getting into some of the details of the case, its background, the context, and delighted that you would kind of share some of your time with us. So I just want to get right into it. As in terms of the structure, what we're going to do is you and I will have a bit of a conversation for the first initial 20 minutes or so, but we will open it up to anything else coming in from the chat. I have questions that could have us talking all day, but I won't occupy or monopolize the entire time myself. So let me just get started. Can you just give us a little bit of background? I mean, I know that many of us know about the Rohingya situation superficially from news reports, and we know about this court ruling and the involvement of Gambia, but also very superficially sort of from news reports. Give us a little bit of background as to this case, how Gambia got involved in it, and sort of how it came about.
Well, Assalamu alaikum, Professor, and Assalamu alaikum to everyone who is dialed in. It is indeed my pleasure to be here amongst my fellow Muslim brothers and sisters and others, and to try to lift the spirits up in these very, very challenging times for our world. So it is my pleasure to be here. But also for my own self, I have been watching some of the sessions, and this is a great idea. I would like to congratulate the Concordia Forum and all the hosts for really keeping us all interested in things around our world. So yes, how did it all start? What's the context? Well, in 2018, I represented the Gambia at the OIC Council of Foreign Ministers meeting. In fact, I wasn't supposed to go. It was by sheer twist of fate. I was in New York with our foreign minister, and he, for some other official reason, could not make the meeting in Bangladesh, Dhaka. So he requested me to go in his stead and to represent the Gambia. So I was available for that. So from New York, I left for Dhaka, not having an idea of how my life and that of my country, insofar as the Rohingya is concerned is going to change. So here I was, I boarded a flight to Dhaka, arrived, and the next day a trip was being organized for the delegates to visit the refugee camps at Cox's Bazar. I knew, of course, about the Rohingya because we have seen on our television screens and on news headlines the terrible things that were going on in Rakhine State against the Muslims there. And so I had some idea about what I was going to find in the refugee camps. But to be honest, nothing had prepared me for the extent and gravity and seriousness of the crimes that were being committed against these poor people in Rakhine State. So there we were. We boarded a flight organized by the Bangladeshi government, and we went to Cox's Bazar. And so as we drove through through this huge refugee camp at Cox's Bazar in a convoy, and so when we arrived, we were taken on a little tour, and then arrangements were made for us to interact with some of the refugees who shared their stories with us. And as I sat there, it was a little bit surreal because I wouldn't believe that this is what was going on in Rakhine State, and that the wall, to be honest, was not really accurately reporting the extent of the gravity of these crimes. I sat there, and as I listened to these refugees, the question came to me, but why is the world silent about this? What is going on? Is it because they are, is it because the world does not care about these Muslims who are suffering in this part of the world that nobody has bothered to speak up or speak out against it? Because I would have certainly been aware had the world made a lot of noise about it. We all know how when big and more powerful countries want to push an agenda, how they make sure they shout so loud that every nook and cranny around the world will hear about it. And here I am sitting down and listening to these horrendous stories from these Muslims who have gone through so much trauma. And I'm finding out the extent of this trauma for the first time after a few years. And so I made up my mind on my way back to Bangladesh that something has to be done about this. We can't all just come here, visit these refugees, they share their stories, and we all go back to our lives as if it's business as usual. That cannot be the case. That should not be the case. So when we went back, I suggested that we must establish a ministerial committee, even if it's going to be an ad hoc one under the OIC, to deal with accountability for these crimes against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. So this is basically the context. This is how everything started. So I engaged the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh at the time and a few other ministers who were present, and floated the idea. And I said, we have to do something. The OIC, when I sat in that room and looked around the table and I saw the countries that are represented in the OIC, the amount of human and material resources, mashallah, available in these countries. And I said, surely there is something we can do as a group if we come together. And so this is how the idea kicked off. And I was pleased that the OIC Council of Foreign Ministers unanimously approved our resolution to establish this ad hoc ministerial committee on accountability for human rights against the Rohingya, and also was very, very honored to have been elected as the chair. So this is basically the context. This is how it all started.
Let me and thank you for that, because that that this is as someone who is a historian and particularly a legal historian, oftentimes these parts of the story are really crucial to establishing how we get from sort of the eventual ruling, where the starting off point is, and often don't get covered in the media. So thank you for that. Before we move into the ruling itself and sort of what happened there, I want you to, and I know it's difficult, and obviously it was particularly moving for you. Can you share with us, so that we understand sort of the depth of the tragedy that's happening, some of the stories at least, or what moved you in particular that you were hearing, so that we also can appreciate sort of the gravity of this situation, which doesn't always come across in the media?
Well, it was not only the killings as such, it was the manner in which these killings were done. Some of the stories that I heard from the refugees, the men telling me, and as a man, I can relate and understand their pain, telling me that their wives were raped in front of them, that their daughters were gang raped in front of them while they held them on a gunpoint and made them watch that. Now, as a father and a husband, I couldn't believe the agony that these men must have gone through. And then the women would tell you how, of course, they were brutalized, how sexual violence was used in the open to terrible results. How women carrying their babies would have these babies snatched forcefully from them and thrown into fires next door, and then they are held back from getting into the fires to actually save their babies, while being left alive to see that with their own eyes. Now, these are very painful stories, and these are the kind of stories that I heard when I heard, and it brought back very, very painful memories of my experience as a prosecutor over the Rwandan genocide. And I thought, this is not just about killings and crimes. It was the very nature and the gravity of these crimes that, more than anything else, got me to want to do something about them.
No, thank you for sharing that, and hope we can come in, because back to that, your role that you played in Rwanda, and I would love your thoughts on that as well. But let me move now to the recent ruling at the ICJ. Can you, I guess, before we get to that, I mean, part of the question that comes up, you said you established this ministry, you're chairing this committee. Why go to the ICJ? Why is that important? And why is this sort of genocide classification, why was that so important for you all?
Well, when I proposed the establishment of this ad hoc ministerial committee, and I was made the chair, and I was given as chair the responsibility to move it forward, to look at the options and explore possibilities that we can use to ensure legal accountability for what was going on in Rakhine State against these Muslims. And so I looked at the various options based on my own personal experience as well. But I also contacted one or two other experts to see what other options we can think about moving this forward. We looked at the options and then settled on the ICJ route. Is because we thought it the highest judicial organ of the United Nations is perhaps a good place to start if we want to arouse or awaken the voice of the international community. And the ICJ, as you well know, is the court that is the guardian of the Genocide Convention. And having made up my mind that what I heard from the refugees in Bangladesh was textbook genocide. I thought the forum where we should go to deal with accountability for this genocide is the International Court of Justice. And it is the forum that actually I got consensus on. Every member of the ministerial committee accepted that going the ICJ route is perhaps the most effective at this point, particularly when the conclusion is that what was going on in Rakhine State was genocide. And so this is how we chose the ICJ, and this is what led Gambia to file its case at the ICJ with the support of the OIC. But it's only the first legal step, not by all means the last, but the first. And I think what we wanted to do was to awaken the conscience of the world. And I believe that we have achieved that to a large extent after we went to the ICJ.
Thank you. And so picking up on that last point and potentially going into maybe more technical ideas as it relates to the law, and for those who are interested in that, shut off for the next minute or so. But so you went to the ICJ and you proposed what and you got what? Because as I understand it, there was a request with regard to the classification of genocide. What came out were these provisional measures, because obviously my sense, correct me if I'm wrong, is that genocide classification will take a long time. And so explain to us what you went in asking, what you got, and how you feel about sort of what has been obtained from this ruling and what comes next.
Okay. Well, after the decision was made to go to the ICJ, as I said, was based partly on my personal judgment about the commission of genocide based on the stories that I have heard, but also having looked at the reports of the United Nations fact-finding missions, all of which point strongly to genocidal intent being accompanied in the acts that were being perpetrated against the Rohingyas in Rakhine State. And so we instructed our lawyers that the Gambia was bringing a case against Myanmar for the commission of genocide against the Muslims in Rakhine State. That is the main substance of our case. And of course, cases at the ICJ do take long, and we are aware of the continuing threats against the Muslims who were still in Rakhine State. And in the interim, we said to the ICJ, well, while you are considering our case against Myanmar, while you are considering our allegations that Myanmar has committed genocide, we want you to protect the remaining Rohingyas who are still in Rakhine State, pending your decision on whether or not Myanmar has committed genocide, which takes a few years. And so we asked for provisional measures. We went to the ICJ and said, do please order Myanmar to stop all actions that will amount or may amount to genocide, while you're considering our main allegation that they have committed genocide. And we submitted 6 requests, 2 of which are procedural. That is, the Gambia and Myanmar should undertake to submit reports to the court about their compliance with the court's orders, etc. Now, the court did not give that, but the court gave us more. The court not only asked Myanmar to take all necessary actions to preserve evidence that could amount to genocide, and also to stop all actions that may amount to genocide, but the court, for the first time in its history, created a monitoring mechanism whereby Myanmar is going to report to the court 4 months after the ruling on the steps it has taken to comply with the court's provisional measures, and every 6 months thereafter. it's unprecedented. It's the first time that the International Court of Justice has issued such a. So Myanmar is now under a legal obligation, not only to stop the acts that may amount to genocide against the Rohingya Muslims who are still in Rakhine State, but that they should also show to the court the efforts that they are making to comply with that ruling. So this is pretty much what we have asked for and what we have got for the time being.
Oh, that's a great explanation. And in terms of, well, I want to, we were at about the 20-minute mark, and so I want to pick up a couple of the audience questions as I also ask my own. So one of them that's related to this is someone's asking, how did you feel going into the Icj session? You know, were you expecting a positive outcome, a negative outcome? What were your feelings going in?
When I was going in on the first occasion to argue the provisional measures request, I saw a video of the Rohingyas in the camps chanting Gambia, Gambia. I almost cried. I then realized the enormity of the responsibility that has been placed on my shoulders and the shoulders of the Muslim Ummah in general. This is as much about human rights as it is about Islamic solidarity. I felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders, and as I walked in there, I thought, this is the least the world can do for these refugees and their families that are still in Rakhine State. I have never felt such weight of responsibility in my life. Then the second time that I was going into the court to hear the court's ruling on our request for provisional measures, I didn't know what to feel. I was hopeful because I knew that in the past, the court had granted provisional measures in even less serious circumstances than the one that we have presented before the court. So I was hopeful for the best, yet I was prepared for the worst. Because what if the ruling doesn't go our way? The blow that was going to send to the refugees, not to me. This was not about me. This was about the Rohingyas and their families and their plight and their suffering. And so my mind was all on the blow that this was going to do on those, on the Rohingya population. And so I walked in there, kept my faith in Allah, prayed as I usually do, and then left Allah to do the rest. And mashallah, I was very, very pleased as I sat there and watched the president of the court deliver that landmark unprecedented ruling in international law. It was a triumph of our humanity and of international justice.
Alhamdulillah, that's wonderful to hear. And you know, to give people a context in terms of numbers, you know, you're talking about 600,000 Rohingya that are still in Myanmar that require these type of protections that you have spoken of, let alone the you know 700,000 some that are now refugees, for whom, as you rightfully note, this would have been a crushing blow if the international community in this forum had not stepped forward. So thank you for that. Someone
very worried about the refugees.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Sorry. So someone has asked, and this was a question of mine as well, is, you know, we've seen sort of the good side in terms of the positive of this process. What were the challenges? What were the obstacles in your way at, you know, state level or otherwise? What are the kind of, that you are able to share with us, these sort of challenges and political challenges in this process?
Well, I'm glad you have qualified the question that and limited it to those that I'm able to share.
Yes.
Naturally, understandably, I can't share all the challenges. some are political, some are diplomatic. But the first challenge really that I had, I think it was easier at the level of the OIC, and perhaps it's because they trusted me, they trusted my background and my expertise. So it was easy to persuade my colleagues there that we have to adopt a legal accountability process to complement the diplomatic, the humanitarian, and the political efforts that the OIC was deploying in this matter. So this was the easy part. Now the more difficult part was to convince my own government about the need to take up this case, whereas the Gambia is not directly affected by acts that were perpetrated against the Rohingya, have the world across. So in the end, I was able also to persuade my president, who was very supportive, and my colleagues in government. And then of course, the remaining challenge was to persuade the country, the rest of the people in the country. As you know, we are also going through our own transitional justice processes here in the Gambia, having come out of 2 decades of authoritarian rule where the previous administration and the former president engaged in acts of brutality against ordinary Gambians. We had experienced enforced disappearances, murder, torture, killings. So we are also confronting our own past in a way that would allow us to avoid it from happening again. And I am also leading that process here. We've established a truth and reconciliation process. The information that is coming out of that is so grave, so painful, that I am having to rally the country around towards a reconciliatory process. Now, to take the case of Myanmar at the ICJ to ensure that they are legally accountable for their actions has sparked debate in the country as to why we are not doing the same against those who were also perpetrating similar crimes here in the Gambia. So you can see the challenge that I had in persuading some Gambians, not the majority. They were a minority, but their concerns were still legitimate. So those are some of the challenges that I confronted in this case. But alhamdulillah, the overwhelming majority of Gambians came on board with greater explanation. Gambia, just to provide context, is about 90%, at least 90% Muslims. And so when they realized that this is about helping other Muslims who have been targeted on account of their religion, I think everyone almost came on board, and it made it much easier for me to go and represent my country in that case.
No, thank you. That's fascinating. Distinction that you've just highlighted about sort of pursuing truth and reconciliation in your own country, which for those who know, the sort of individual accountability in that context becomes very different than what you're pursuing at ICJ. So I could see that balance. I know one thing that came to my mind and has come up with some folks is, there are certain countries in the OIC that are not signatories to the Rome Statute, which is very important in this context. So can you share with us at all how you convinced them? Because that was probably not a small task.
Well, the Rome Statute establishes the International Criminal Court, which deals with individual criminal responsibility. So the Rome Statute deals with people who are identified for their participation in a crime so that they can be prosecuted. In the case of the International Court of Justice, which is the ICJ, it deals with state responsibility. And part of the reasons why, and I'm glad you brought me back to this point, part of the reasons why we also opted for the ICJ is because we wanted at this point to make this the responsibility of the state of Myanmar and not any particular person as such. Maybe that will come later. But for the time being, we wanted to expose the state of Myanmar as a state for failing and committing genocide, for failing to prevent genocide and for committing genocide. So we thought that by going to the ICJ, we will be bringing the state of Myanmar as a state party to the Genocide Convention, so that it becomes the state of Myanmar that will defend itself. And that's why the State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi herself came to the International Court of Justice to represent her country, because that was our objective. We wanted it to be a matter of state to state. And that's why we went to the ICJ. So in spite of the fact that many countries in the OIC are not signatories to the Rome Statute, this was the International Court of Justice to which all members of the United Nations are signatories. Now, it's not all members of the UN who are signatories to the Genocide Convention. Luckily for the Gambia, Myanmar is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. The Gambia is a signatory, and that's why we could actually seize the jurisdiction of the court. And I'm pleased that the court did recognize that as well.
Yeah, and for those who sort of are not familiar with ICJ, the fact that both of Myanmar and Gambia are signatories and have ratified the Geneva Convention means that this dispute over the interpretation application of genocide, that term, can then come up for discussion for the jurisdiction of the court. Okay, so I want to turn now. We have some questions coming, which I'll also bring in. But you know, one thing that some skeptics may put forward is, well, you know, what does this ruling practically mean? Is, you know, because the UN has no enforcement mechanism except for the cooperation of the state. So on a practical level, you know, is there sort of anything meaningful that this is going to bring on the ground? How would you kind of respond to that?
Well, the ruling itself should not also be overplayed. It's not going to automatically or dramatically change the situation on the ground for the refugees, both in Cox's Bazar or in Bangladesh, and also for the remaining Rohingya population in Rakhine State. However, what it does is it has the backing of the entire United Nations system. It means that Myanmar can no longer ignore the plight of the Rohingya inside its territory. It means that Myanmar knows that the whole world is watching their actions and how they treat the remaining Rohingya population. What it means is that we can always elevate the stakes if we want to. The options are there. The General Assembly is one option, the Security Council is another. And you could see the reaction of the international community following the ruling from the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations that issued a statement to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. You can see the comments and the statements of support from countries like the Netherlands and Canada and the UK, the European Union. I think all of these add to increasing the pressure on Myanmar to take action. The ruling has both the moral, the legal force to wake Myanmar from its slumber, if at all it was asleep, and for it to take note that the world has realized what is going on. They can no longer hide it, and that they should be careful how they treat their own people, because this is only the first step of a series of measures and actions that may follow. So we have, on our part as well, been happy with the fact that finally, members of the Rohingya community have had their plight and their story told in a forum that the whole world has access to. If you are thinking about a judicial hierarchy around the world, the ICJ sits at the top of that hierarchy. If you want to shout loudest, legally speaking, to be heard, that is where you go. And that is what we have done. And the Rohingya have finally been recognized as a protected group. And this is very significant. in the finding for genocide. The ICJ ruling on provisional measures has identified the Rohingya as a protected group that needs the protection of the international community. And so the Rohingya have had their first day in court. It's by no means going to be their last day in court. So the significance of the ruling, to summarize what I'm going to say, because I can't go into all these details, is that this is the first time that the Rohingya have had their day in court, and it's the beginning, just the beginning of their march to justice.
Thank you. That is very, very well put. And I think you sort of touch on this idea as well at a very core level that the Rohingya were not even recognized as Rohingya by Myanmar. And in some respects, at the very least, this court case has given them that status of this protected group and considered them as a group in a way that they were not even getting that recognition internally, at least to some degree. So we have about some 25 minutes or so, and I want to go in a few different directions based on what questions we're getting. One question that's coming up over and over is this question of, okay, how can we, or is there a way, or is there potential for a ruling like this unprecedented historic ruling, to be applied in other situations? And we think, for instance, of the plight of in Kashmir, of Kashmiris and sort of what they've been going through there, or the reports we're hearing of the situation of the Uyghurs in China, or if we look at the Syrian situation, obviously very different contexts. And we clearly, the ICJ is dealing here with the Rohingya, had previously done sort of provisional measures in Serbia, a different context there. But what are your thoughts with regard to the prospects for these other groups or other communities who might think, okay, what can we learn from this?
Well, in my view, the biggest challenge that the Muslim Ummah has to protect one another is unity. It's our unity. If we come together, the OIC has such huge potential for us as Muslims to use to protect our other Muslim brothers and sisters around the world. All we need to do is tap into that huge resource base available to us within the OIC. Just look at the OIC member states. Just look at, mashallah, the material resources that Allah has bestowed on us. Just look at the human resources that Allah has blessed us with. If we come together, we will perhaps be the most powerful force on earth. We can then seek to resolve problems affecting Muslims, especially Muslims who are minorities in other countries. But what are we doing to ensure that we harness that potential, those resources? I think this, perhaps to me, is the biggest challenge for us overcoming our problems. We have it within our fingertips. The OIC is here. We are all member states. We can explore the potential of this organization, which is huge, to resolve the problems of Muslims around the world. Unity, I think, of purpose is perhaps the biggest challenge for the Muslim Ummah.
Is the, so, you know, we're talking here at the state level and sort of some of these dynamics. Some people in the chat are asking, at the grassroots level, what can be done or should be done? Is there something that you would recommend to people at the grassroots level that they should be doing with regard to supporting the Myanmar situation and this case?
Well, keep the pressure up, keep the pressure on. Let's not take our eye off the ball. what we are talking about here is lives being lost every day. It's children being denied of their dreams of growing up and becoming doctors and lawyers and scientists. What we're talking about is being killed only because they are different from those who kill them. So what we should be doing is to keep the pressure on at the grassroots level. Let us continue to talk about this. Let us continue to use every avenue at our disposal to make sure that the world does not forget the Rohingya.
Thank you. And I want to pivot then a little bit to speak about your prior role, because this is not your first involvement with a situation of genocide. You were a prosecutor with regard to the Rwanda trial and what happened there. And for those who don't know, that was a situation of within 6 months, looking at close to 800,000 people having been killed by internal sort of conflict between the Hutu and Tutsi. For you, as someone who was a prosecutor with regard to Rwanda and now your involvement here, how would you compare the experiences, the challenges in those experiences? How would you compare sort of what was more effective here, less effective? What do you think those two experiences together?
Well, the thing is, I spent almost a decade and a half prosecuting genocide at the Rwanda Tribunal. In fact, I'm not sure if you have seen Hotel Rwanda, the movie, but if you have, the bad guy who is depicted in that movie, General Augustin Bizimungu, who was the chief of staff of the Rwandan side, was the guy I was, whose case I was in charge of. I was the one prosecuting his case. And of course, I later moved on to the appeals division, where I defended the conviction of Colonel Tiones Pagashoa, who was the mastermind of the Rwandan genocide. So, and thereafter, I have been involved in the cases of 10 other accused persons. So I have done a lot of cases at the Rwandan genocide. And while each genocide is different, while each genocide has its own characteristics, but there are certain similarities that cut across every genocide. And what I have heard when I interacted with the refugees at Cox's Bazar reminded me of exactly what the Tutsis were going through during the genocide in Rwanda. This process of dehumanization, calling them names, to basically dehumanize them than human beings. That allows the perpetrator of genocide to be able to carry out the killings and the brutality meted out to the victims without necessarily having a guilty conscience. Now, the similarities are quite a few. I don't want to take too much time on that, but the modus operandi, the organized and systematic attacks, the collaboration with civilian militias, etc., are all very common features. But but above all, it's the indifference of the international community. The international community did not intervene in Rwanda enough to stop the genocide in 1994. 25 years later, we're here again talking about the ineffectiveness of the international community's response to the ongoing genocide in Myanmar. And I think that is a serious concern. And that is why the Icj case is even more significant, because it is beyond doubt laying the facts bare for the international community not to be able to ignore it anymore. So this is one concern that I think in respect to the response of the international community. But again, talking about my experience in Rwanda and how that ties in to this case in Myanmar, well, it was that experience which informed first and foremost this legal accountability process under the aegis of the OIC, but it was also that experience which allowed me to recognize the hallmarks of genocide that were being perpetrated against the Rohingya. So there is obviously a lesson that I have learned from the genocide in Rwanda, which when applied to the case of the Rohingya in Myanmar has enabled me to come to the conclusion that something has to be done about it. Now, I'm not sure whether I responded to your question 100%, but if I don't, let me know what I have missed out on, and then I can complement the response.
No, I think that was good enough. I think you sort of reflected. I wanted you to reflect on your Rwandan experience and how it played in here, and you did that very helpfully. One thing I want to bring up, which we haven't talked about yet, is some of the potential obstacles that lay ahead. One of them is that's talked about is this idea that China at different points, and again, I'm going to preface this by saying this is an open case. I realize there's political limitations and even sort of some restrictions that you might have in what you can talk about. So if that's the case with this question, we'll move on to something else. But China has threatened to veto anything that comes up with Myanmar. They sort of have given Myanmar quite a lot of support over the years in this particular situation. How do you approach that as a potential obstacle? Are there ways in which you have thought about overcoming that, or is that just a bridge you will cross when and if it comes?
Well, we have to be realistic as well. The world is about geopolitical interests. China certainly has interests in Myanmar, and so they will protect that interest, just like all other countries would protect their national interests wherever that is. But on the other hand, I also believe that China believes in the peaceful resolution of disputes. And the fact that the Gambia has chosen to resolve its dispute with Myanmar in the most peaceful manner through the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, every country on earth, including China, welcomes. Because, as I said, every country wants to settle disputes peacefully. What we need to do is to continue to engage countries like China and Myanmar itself, so that it can see the folly of its ways, the dangers and the pains and the sufferings that it is causing on others, so that it can change its ways. This is an opportunity that Myanmar and its allies should seize, because the world is watching, the world is looking at them, and this, it will only bring in more criticism, will bring in unnecessary pressure, will bring in unnecessary attention on themselves, which I don't think they themselves will accept, need. So this is an opportunity that countries like China must seize. And I believe, as I said, that China believes in the peaceful resolution of disputes, and I am sure that we need to engage with China on a continuous basis and all allies that can have influence on Myanmar. Because our ultimate objective is not to embarrass any government or anybody. Our ultimate objective is to stop the suffering of the Rohingya, is to stop the persecution and the genocide of the Rohingya. That is our primary objective. If we get that, I'll go to sleep. I'm knowing that I've done my part.
Alhamdulillah. And it's interesting, sort of as you relate the geopolitics of it, because one of the things that we can't forget, and that has potentially played a role, is that Myanmar went through this transition to democracy, and so there was this period of time where even 2012 we have a state visit from Obama to Myanmar. There goes back in 2014 that there is sort of a lot of leeway that was given to Myanmar, because the feeling was, oh, it's a fragile state and we can't disrupt it too much. And to some degree, some of those ideas may continue to linger, and the Rohingya become sort of expendable to some degree there, unfortunately. But going back to Myanmar, one of the arguments that Myanmar makes is, and I'm curious as to your response to that. Myanmar says, look, we need our own domestic criminal justice system to handle this, and we will, their independent commission of inquiry comes back and shortly after, I think, the ruling saying, oh, we didn't find genocide, but we found crimes against humanity and some evidence of sexual violence. We will prosecute these within our system. What's your sort of response to that, or to a country saying, oh, let us handle this internally and don't kind of interfere in our sovereignty?
Well, I think we have argued before the court, and the court has accepted our argument that we are not satisfied with Myanmar's undertaking to rely on its own internal justice mechanisms to deal with this. They have had ample opportunity to do so. They have time and again failed to do so. And I think our arguments before the ICJ has debunked their submissions in that regard, and has basically unraveled the hollowness of that argument. So we did not believe it. The court accepted or agreed with us, hence the ruling on provisional measures that was imposed on Myanmar by the court. We all know the reality is different from what Myanmar has claimed before the court. We have seen how they have had a sham trial of those who were responsible for killing the 10 unarmed, and for summarily executing the 10 unarmed civilian men. The story that was exposed by those Reuters journalists, and instead of pursuing perpetrators, they went and we have seen how they have tried the alleged perpetrators, convicted them, sentenced them to a number of years, and then released them a few months after. Everything that Myanmar has done with respect to the Rohingya is a sham, is a whitewash, and that is why we don't trust in their internal judicial system to deal with this case adequately.
No, and that's it's great that you point out some of these challenges. The June 2012 killing of these 10 Muslim men who went into a town, or went through a town that has particularly anti-Muslim feelings, and sort of the failure of the state apparatus there, and the subsequent involvement of Border Patrol and others in some of these attacks on Muslim villages and the failure to have any kind of state accountability there internally makes a very strong case for why you had to go to the ICJ. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask a couple of the questions that have come up in the public chat, and I'll just ask them together for you. And they're different questions, but I'll ask them together to give you an opportunity to speak on it a bit. And then if we have time for one more, I may ask one final question myself. So a couple of the questions. One is, would you agree that Gambia's political stature has increased tremendously due to this effort? That's one question. Another question is about what part of your faith, or what within your own faith, from Quran or Sirah or whatever else, really motivated or pushed you here. You've talked about the idea of Muslim solidarity, but from within the faith itself, was there something that pushed you? And then the third question is the idea of sort of humanizing the situation. So speaking of it in human terms versus Islamic terms, is there value to doing that, doing it more on human terms than Islamic terms? So those are the three questions from our chat. One, again, is Gambia's. What do you feel about Gambia's political stature? Has it increased tremendously here? What part of your faith played a role in this? And then do you think that there's greater value to speak of it in human terms as opposed to just Islamic terms? And I can repeat
Well,
those.
I will start with the last. Yeah, no, that's fine. I will start with the last. I think we all agree that this is about our humanity after all. So speaking about it in human terms is certainly the broadest appeal. It doesn't mean that there is not an element of Islamic solidarity in it, which we must also recognize. And that is why the OIC is supporting the Gambia. That is why the ad hoc ministerial committee under the aegis of the OIC. That is a fact that we can't also avoid. But certainly, above everything else, this is about our humanity. So speaking about it in human terms is has the broader appeal, and I agree with that. In terms, which part of my religious belief influenced my decision? Well,
yeah, was there some part of, when you were involved in this or before, a part of your faith, the Quran or Hadith or Sirah or something that you would draw upon?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the most obvious one is that I have been taught from my childhood days that al-Muslim aqul Muslim. A Muslim is a brother to other Muslim, and it's our responsibility to protect one another as Muslims. And that part of my faith has been strong. I come from a very strongly religious family. My father brought us up in strict Islamic teachings, and I grew up with that. Whatever I do in my life has some Islamic influence, especially when it comes to matters that affect other Muslims. So that is a huge part of my belief, of my life, and it will continue to be so, inshallah. Now, in terms of, I can't remember the first question now. That's
about
that's
Gambia.
About the Gambia,
about
yes.
Gambia, yeah. And Gambia's, what do you think about, would you agree that Gambia's political stature has increased tremendously by this effort?
Well, I know that the Gambia has now become more widely known as a result of this case. Mashallah, wherever Gambians go nowadays and they meet Muslims, even non-Muslims, they tell them, oh yes, that's the country that took the Myanmar to the Icj. So there's no doubt that both the Gambia and the OIC has gained some credibility in this process. And but we don't want to focus too much on others, not on Gambia or OIC. Our focus is on how we can change the lives of the Rohingya. We should always bear that in mind, and that is why I have always taken the opportunity to state that this is not about Gambia or Myanmar or the OIC. This is about the plight of the Rohingya, what the international community must do to stop this barbarity and brutality that is being meted out to them, and to recognize them for what they are, human beings who have a right to live. And no one has a right to take that away from them.
Well, I know that we are right at our time here, and so I just wanted to, on behalf of myself, Concordia Forum, and all the people who benefited tremendously from listening to you, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you the best. You're in our duas, and of course the Rohingya are as well.
If you indulge me, sorry to interrupt, if you indulge me. Sorry, Minister Abubacarr, I have to tell you how amazingly inspirational you were. So the Rohingya issue has been an open wound for Muslims all over the world, and you have actually done something about it. And I would like everyone on this call to join me. Please unmute yourself for a second and join me in a round of applause. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Minister, what you managed to do,
I'm very humble. Thank you very much for this. I am really humble. Thank you all. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So,
Yes. No, I was just saying, thank you all. I'm really humbled. I'm really humbled by all of this, although I don't think I deserve it. But thank you nevertheless. Thank you.
and
I'm
thank
really
you
humbled.
throughout this conversation for centering the Rohingya and for centering their plight. You know, that is a testament to you, but also an important reminder for all of us as to what this is truly about, and that we can each play a role. We don't all have to go to the ICJ. We can each play a role, even as you noted, to continue to bring attention to this issue and to support it as much as we can.
Exactly. Well, thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much, Professor. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Minister.
I hope we meet again.
Yes, and thank you, Professor Adnan. That was a wonderful, very insightful session, and hope to see you both in the near future, inshallah.
Inshallah.
I'm delighted now that we're moving on to our next session with two incredible female Muslim politicians from both sides of the Atlantic. I believe they're both on the call. At least I saw them a few minutes earlier. We're joined by moderating the session will be Naz Shah, who is Minister for Social Cohesion